right, I'm here with my friend Elvis, my man. Welcome, and how are you doing, brother?
I'm good, Walt. I'm good. Thank you very much for inviting me, man. This is a really exciting podcast idea. So I'm glad to be joining the who's who of the podcast world on your show here.
Nice, man. Well, I mean, the who's who. You were my first person to call. One, just the background of everyone knows that I'm the Gringo doing some Latin inspired events. So I'm always trying to learn and make sure I'm getting things correct. So you've been a vital part in helping me, especially in the DC area. So I guess even before we get started, I'd like to, maybe you just kind of give everyone a little bit about who you are, your background, upbringing, so we can kind of set a little standard before we deep dive into some conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for, again, inviting me. So my name is Elvis Cordova. I always describe myself as the child of immigrants. My family immigrated here from El Salvador. Funny part about my upbringing is I was actually born in LA. And then when I was about 1 year old, we moved back to El Salvador. And shortly after we got there, the Civil War broke out in El Salvador, which is a horrific war and caused a lot of migration of Salvadorans, not only to the United States, but around the world. My family eventually immigrated up to the Boston, Massachusetts area. We had some family there. And that's where I grew up, at least the formative years, elementary, high school, and college. We're all up in Boston. Did public education and was lucky enough to go to Northeastern University there. Studied criminal justice with a minor in Latin American history. And from there, did graduate degree at NYU. And that was a master's in public administration. And then, my career really, took off from there in terms of working in the public sector. One thing that had been always important to me was I was the beneficiary of a lot of different opportunities, whether it was scholarships to be able to go to school, whether it was a public system that really, provided me with a strong founding, and, internships, fellowships. I just always looked for opportunities. I was able to find them. And I always thought that, if all these people are investing in my development, I have to find a way to give back and provide a pipeline for others to be able to benefit from this. And so to me, going into the public sector made sense. So worked at the UN for a time, then worked for the federal government for about 15 years here in DC, worked abroad in different internships that allowed me to really just keep on, serving to me what was the public sector and being able to give back by creating opportunities. And it's been a great ride. I mean, the proudest moments were the last 5 years of my federal career were in the Obama administration. And that to me was kind of when I was able to get these executive leadership positions that allow me to really lead programs, lead people, and create opportunities for people. Since then, I had my own consulting practice that I was able to continue that work.
Oh man, that's cool. That's awesome that you had some people behind you and getting some scholarships and doing some amazing things, with them. I know, when we started talking and we started doing Arte Agave in DC, you were with a bunch of, you were with a couple of different, groups that were, pro Hispanica, sort of these nonprofit groups that were, that you're helping out in DC that are, pro Latin and trying to help the Latin community. I guess kind of what is, if we could talk about a little bit about what is, maybe just kind of give us, in your opinion, what is the Latin community in America today? What is it, what is the U.S. turning into as far as the Latin community and understanding, kind of what we're going through today, right? There's so many modern issues, just on our doorstep right now, So what are the issues, that you see in America today? And kind of where is the United States going, and what's the direction that you think we're heading into right now?
Man, so it's a complicated question, but I think that, the U.S. has always been referred to as a melting pot, right?
Mm.
And so I think that in order to get that melt to happen the right way, it demands a certain type of temperature for that integration to happen. And sometimes it can boil over. And I think we're experiencing some of that now. The U.S. Is, to me, history was always important to learn. Not only was it a great story of different cultures and different people, but it begins to give you an opportunity to learn where we've been so you can better calibrate where we're going. And I think that it's an integration that's going on between, there's this second immigration population that happened late 90s, kind of early 2000s, that now we're going through. I think that there's some leftover issues from the civil rights movement that are still being addressed today. And I think that the U.S. has always been grappling with this. I talk about the American dream to different groups and how each successive generation that came to the United States brought their sense of what their American dream was, right? Whether it was, the early pilgrims wanting religious freedom, right? Whether it was the Eastern European kind of German population in the mid 1800s that were coming because they were escaping political persecution, whether it was the integration of what used to be Mexico in the latter 1800s, and they were all focused on, education. I think that each successive generation brings a sense of the American dreams. I think the African American population, had two sets of American dreams. One was, being able to attain their freedom and being their livelihoods, and then later, being able to have voting rights or, equal justice and economic opportunities. And so it's always in a state of flux with the United States. And I think that with the Latino population, we've always been there, and I'll explain that in a minute. But we're also, Latin America is such a diverse place, even more than the United States, in terms of 26 countries, all under one common language and kind of cultural foundation. And so now coming into the United States, with migration, and how's that playing out, whether it be Cubans, whether it be Mexicans, whether it be Central Americans, how does that play out when you got all these different cultures coming in here? And so to me, the beautiful thing about the United States is it's always modernizing itself, right? But again, going back to the original, just in order for that to happen, there's going to be some times where it boils over. And the trick to me is, how do we correctly, adjust the temperature so it doesn't really spill over, which it does, and making sure that the boiling happens or the integration happens in a comfortable way and in a way that's meaningful for everybody.
Yeah, man. It's super interesting. You're kind of talking about what's happening today a little bit. And, I guess where, I want to go with you is, you're a person who's studies this. You're a person who knows about this. Like I said, I'm somebody that's super just high level. We talked about it. I've had guests on the podcast before where, we talked about, I always ask people like, hey, what were they teaching about Latin studies in school? And everyone's kind of like, nothing, you know what I mean? There's not much, there's really not, there's history, but there's not much history being taught, and when you ask, if someone asks me like, hey, what did you learn about like Latin studies in high school or something, or Hispanic culture, there's not much there. So like what, if you could summarize and I've had teachers on here too, and people just, it just seems to be this, there's a couple of bullet points of a couple people and then that's it. If you had to kind of summarize just history in general, right? And then if you could maybe bullet point a few things about what about Latin history should people be learning today? What could maybe be something that could be put into the schools, or maybe just some high level thoughts on past history, you know, if you could just kind of summarize it, you know, because like I said, I've been trying to like get this from people as well, and it just everything just gets kind of glossed over, and you know, and people kind of forget about history. So I don't know if you could just sort of maybe bullet point a few things that you could bring into modern times or bring into the school system that you think is super important. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
No, thank you. You know, one of the real reasons why I've been a big supporter of what you're doing is you're doing just that. You're stretching your boundaries of understanding, and you do it in a very thoughtful and considerate way, right? How do you learn from people? There's not to go off on a tangent, but there was this Brazilian sociologist called Paulo Freire, and he developed this notion of pedagogy. He wrote this book called Pedagogy for the Oppressed. And in a nutshell, it's, you know, he was kicked out of Brazil. He was working with indigenous communities. There was a military dictatorship that took over. He was kind of kicked out. It's a little bit too radical for them. Goes to Guatemala and is working with communities there. And with indigenous communities there, and something peculiar happened during that. You know, normally I think that the traditional education is the teacher educates the student, and then the student kind of rises to that level and moves on. Pedagogy, the way that Paulo Freire introduced it, was radical, because when he was studying these indigenous communities, all of a sudden they saw that they were the source of information. So here comes this well-educated, rooted man, you know, who they would, you know, normally say, wow, this person is above us in terms of an education level. But then they're like, then if he's above us, why is he studying us? You know, we're kind of the source of information for him. And it was there that they realized themselves, we're smarter in other ways than he is. And he recognized that they recognize this. And something really interesting happened. Education, instead of it being a one-way street, became a two-way street, where they were both learning from each other and creating new out of it. So I see this as an opportunity for that pedagogy, right? Where, you know, and I think that's applicable to a lot of different situations where you can learn along with somebody to create something new. Therefore, you both have learned. And to me, this was important. I learned this in college, the pedagogy of the oppressed notion, because in college, I was looking for a sense of identity, right? Mm-hmm. You know, having grown up in El Salvador for some time and having grown up in the US, and many Latinos go through this, we don't belong in either one. And so we're always looking for the sense of identity, right? When I was in Latin America, people would call me Gringo, right? And because I speak English and I have, you know, a cultural background from the United States. But when I'm in the United States, people are like, no, you're not American, you're Latino, right? Or you're Latin American, or you're an immigrant, right? And so where do we belong, right? We're kind of this generation that's caught in between two worlds. So to me, cultural identity became this important search in college. And that's why history became important. That's why I wanted to dig in a little bit more, because I wanted to learn. So to answer your question, there's kind of three big chunks that I see it in, right? The past, learning really about the history of the United States. There's the present and the future. Let me start with the past. Colonization, I think, is really where it begins. And when you look at Latin America, it's important to know that the immigration to the United States and the early immigration to Latin America are distinct, because people who came to the United States were, for one reason or another, escaping something from their homeland, right? Whether, again, it was the Pilgrims escaping religious persecution, whether it was Eastern Europeans escaping political persecution, they were looking to go someplace and just escape it all and start something new. Meanwhile, in Latin America, to be able to go to the in Latin America, in order to be able to go there, you had to get permission from the crown, the Spanish crown or the Portuguese crown, because they owned Brazil. And so it was only the aristocratic who could be there. And they came there, with an allegiance back to the central government or the kingdom from which they came from. And so that's two different mentalities that kick off there, right? Because the United States was really affected by a sense of enlightenment when the revolution happened, right? it was an enlightenment that was going on in Europe that affected the United States. So that's like, individual freedom, your inalienable rights to pursue liberty, and, the pursuit of happiness. And so these were far-reaching notions that didn't quite reach Latin America, because in Latin America, there were still oligarchies, or, they were still really tied together to the crown. And so this kind of separates the United States and Latin America from the way that they approach politics. And so this was really interesting because it was a historical figure, Simón Bolivar, right? He's like the George Washington of Latin America. And so the United States, declares its independence for 1776, to 1783 there, was when that war went on, or 1781 actually. By 1783, it was recognized. And then around this time, Simón Bolivar, who's one of the richest men in all of the Americas, right, was in the United States at this time. He was coming back from Europe. He had been there for Napoleon's coronation. He's coming back and he sees this experiment that's going on in the United States, and he sees 13 different colonies forming together. So when he goes back to Latin America, which begins their revolution in the early 1800s, he begins seeing, like, around 1815 or so, 1803 in some other parts of Latin America, he really begins thinking of this notion of, like, how can I bring all of these different territories together and have them be one nation, right? Grand experiment, and if he had worked, would have radically changed the dynamics of how the Americas function. But for some reason or another, the countries couldn't coalesce. They couldn't stay together. There was too much bickering in between them, and it doesn't mature. But so Simón Bolivar takes these ideas from the American Revolutionary Movement and tries to instill them in Latin America. The next big idea that really affects Latin America is the Monroe Doctrine. This is, President Monroe, fifth president of the United States, had kind of said, this whole doctrine talked about that the United States, it's kind of tied to manifest destiny to some extent, that the United States was going to expand out. But this one talked about how the Americas were to be guided by more or less the United States, right? In other words, European powers should not be expanding their influence in the United States. And, the United States would be kind of guarding that out, right? Mm. It's a notion that really begins to play out in history later because it affects the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, and that's where, as a result of those wars, the U.S. expanded its territory, right? The Mexican-American War after that happened in the mid-1800s, I think like 1845 to 1850, around there. I'll have to recheck those dates. But what that does is it gives the United States New Mexico, Arizona, California. Texas in 1836 declared its independence from Mexico, but doesn't join the Union until like 1845. Hence why they call it the Great Lone Star State, because for a while it was on its own as an independent nation before it was annexed into the United States, which kicks off a little bit about the Mexican-American War. But the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Guam, brought those territories in, right? And so it expands this whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine. It's also affected later because the Panama Canal, which is in the early 1900s, Panama used to be a territory of Colombia. And through some machinations, it got the independence from Colombia so that it could build this canal, right? And there was, I forget the gentleman's name. There was this dude who maneuvered it all. When I read about him in history, I was like, just so surprised because he kind of led this political movement in Panama that allowed.
Maneuvered what? Who maneuvered what?
It was I can't remember his name. I'll get it. I just remember reading about him in high school. He maneuvered the whole Panama independence movement so that they would break free from Colombia. And as soon as Panama was a sovereign country, that one of the first things it does is it signs a deal with the U.S. to build the Panama Canal, right? But this also begins to, that's a great example of how the US really began to affect Latin America's destiny in terms of, always intervening in the local politics, whether it was to help dictatorships that benefited the United States from an economic standpoint, whether it was to crush insurgencies. I mean, look at the Civil War, right? The Cold War. The Cold War was this great example of how Russia and the United States were fighting de facto conflicts in Latin America and in Southeast Asia to expand communism or capitalism. And so, you have these situations where the United States is like, not in our backyard, right? No, there's not going to be any communist movement here.
Right.
So, that kind of involvement, that kind of stealth involvement on, putting certain people in power, like Pinochet in Chile, or being to, the Bay of Pigs, right? Cuba,
Yeah.
right? And how that kind of plays out.
Yep.
And so that is really, that's all the Monroe Doctrine really being played out. So that's, a snapshot of what the past has been about. And kind of before I move to the present, wanted to see if it all made sense, if there were any questions there.
No, man, I mean, I like, just the kind of the high level thoughts. I think some people forget, we get so wrapped up in today and someone's thoughts or someone's feelings or someone's whatever. And some people just forget sort of the history of things. You know what I mean? They're like, no, we're changing this and we're going to do it this way. We're going to do it that way. And people kind of forget why things are in place. So I think it's why it's kind of important to hear it from you and talk about it again and talk about the Monroe Doctrine. I'm like, I haven't heard that name in like 30 some years. And it's kind of like, maybe a lot of people need to take a bunch of steps back and look into history, right? And why things are the way they are today. Some people just start blaming other groups and other countries and this country, this person, that person. They sort of forget what happened maybe 200, 300, 400 years ago that sort of kind of gave this blueprint to where we are today. So I just, it's good to kind of go over some high level stuff. And, I guess we're going through to this, past, present history or future kind of thing. So, and that does lead into like kind of my next questions about, where we are today in, U.S. interest in Latin America. Is it really an interest, or is it all about just money and politics? Do you really feel like people are trying to help, or they just think like, well, it's a political agenda, or if it's not going to give us money, we're not going to be part of it? I mean, does it really just come down to politics and money in present relationships between Latin countries and United States?
At a very high level, it's all about, I think, geopolitical dominance, right? This goes back to early 1900s as the U.S. is beginning. Now, think of it, right before, even into the 1900s, but I'd say like up to probably World War II, the way colonization had worked was it was all empire building, right? The Spanish had the first big empire when they committed to the Americas. The British topple that empire. The French want to get in there. The French take over Mexico for a while. Napoleon's brother is kind of the leader there, and that leads to a lot of the tensions that built the Mexican-American War. But all of these, European powers were expanding their dominance throughout the world through their empires, right? The Dutch in Africa and in Southeast Asia and so on. And even the Russians had their own empires. So now the U.S., kind of the new kid on the block here, is coming into its prominence at the early 1900s. And I'm reading a book now that talks about this debate of whether they should be an American empire, right? But I think the founding principles of the United States were kind of in clash with how they should be, because we're talking about, the freedom of individuals and, respecting states' rights. And, we had actually revolted from an empire only to go and create another one. So this led to a real clash of ideologies in the early 1900s, where they were trying to figure that out. And I talk more about it, but I'm learning. It's a fascinating book. And it constitutes how the American flag was actually changing too. If you remember, the original flag had, the 13.
Yeah.
Yeah. And each star in each new state, adds a new star to it. So, this was always the big tension there. Even though there's not a per se American empire, right? As the United States got those new territories, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Guam, it began to say, should we have an American empire? I think that conversation, I don't know the answer to that because I'm reading the book, so I'll have to probably come back and tell you what happened there. But I think from, what I can see, it just became of this geopolitical presence, right? Especially after World War II. World War I, we got involved in it, and then we had the chance to kind of, at the end of World War I, have a more prominent role in global politics. But Woodrow Wilson at the time decided to kind of hold back. There were 16 points that he had that really outlined how we should be proceeding. There was a lot of contention around those points. And so the U.S. holds back. But after World War II, the U.S. says, you know what? We really need to spread democracy around. In the U.S., before World War II, U.S. was like the 17th country in terms of GDP in the world. At the end of World War II, because we're the only country that doesn't get devastated by the war, we're number one. We're number one because we have all the technological advances out of World War II. We have the industrial machine.
Yeah, we stole all the scientists from every country.
Or some of them even came here, right? It's this really cool part where Britain was about to fall because of the German bombardments, and they said, we need to send all of our technology research to the United States because if the Germans get it, we're done. Yeah. And when it arrived in Washington, they said it was the single most important package, we had ever received, which was, building radars, building rockets, just all this incredible science that pushed us forward. And the Russians got the other half of that, right? That's why the space race happens, right? Because we both have the technological advancements. But I'm going off on a tangent here. I think that it all goes back to a sense of, how does the United States maintain a geopolitical dominance in global politics to prevent, another dictatorship or another, fascist movement, such as the one that Germany had developed in World War II, or communism as it saw. Out of that comes this kind of economic doctrine that then goes is implemented throughout the world. That's where you have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. They created a kind of global regime where they could have financial stability throughout the world. And so for the US and Latin America, that became very important because Latin America became this growth engine of resources for the United States, and later you see a labor, right? So we've been moving a lot of our labor down to Mexico, right, or certain parts of Latin America, and that's, really being able to use those resources to help again the industrial machine we have here. And it's not a judgment call. Other countries are doing it too. I think I'm just giving you kind of the backdrop. I personally, have some problems with it, but I won't interject those here. I'll just tell you that this is how it's been happening, right? And then from there, this is interesting because now it kind of dovetails into what's going on here with labor. In the 1940s, because agricultural production, this is after the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. So in the 40s and 50s, as the U.S. is now expanding its economic output, they need more labor, right? So they couldn't quite move their productions down to Latin America yet. So what they do is they bring labor up. So there's this famous program called the Bracero program that happens in the 1940s that invited a lot of mostly Mexican, but I believe some Latin American labor workers to come up to the United States and work out in the agricultural sector. Now, again, some people have a problem with the program because the conditions for folks were deplorable. But I think what's important to kind of get out of this is it begins an opening of mass migration into the United States because the U.S. was seen as a place where I can go work to, earn a good living, make some good money, and either stay there or I can come back and, you know, have a better life here in the United States. So to me, I always see the seeds, no pun intended, of, you know, the immigration to the United States in that Bracero program that happened in the 40s and 50s.
That's interesting. I had never even heard of that program before. But I mean, yeah, it's interesting that it's like, hey, let's not go to different countries, like go to China and get everyone do it, but bring everybody here. So it's kind of a reverse thing. Obviously, the borders are very closer than doing something in China. But yeah, so that's interesting. So it's like, hey, here's this program bringing everybody across, but not too many people, right? Is it just people that want to work? And I mean, do you think that just kind of opened up the floodgates and everyone's like, people are going back and be like, hey, America's awesome. Go check it out.
Yeah. A couple of different things happened, right? But what it also did was there were some folks who just stayed here, right? You go someplace, start working. If you were single, you might come here and meet somebody and start a family, right? Then you don't want to. I also think this was like, you know, a time where, you know, laws weren't so, you know, they weren't followed or stringent as they are now, right? I think that, and this is, again, one of my personal perspectives. I think that because in Latin America, let me go back to that point. I talked about oligarchies, right? You know, in Latin America that migrated. And so after the Latin American Revolution for its independence, where the countries begin to free themselves from Spanish rule, you then have one oligarchy being replaced by another, or aristocracy, right? And so you had, you know, these, you know, large landowners kind of controlling everything, and, you know, a whole lot of poor folks working for them. And so this caused a tension that was much stronger in Latin America than in the United States, which led to a lot of subsequent revolutions there, right? You've heard of like Emiliano Zapata or Pepe Benitez, right? Who led these Mexican revolutions. And it's because the conditions were so dire there that, you know, they were just revolting. So what Latin America basically experiences, I remember this in Argentine history. I was living in Argentina for a while, and I saw that every 20 years, there was a shift from dictatorship to a democracy, right? And so think about that from economic perspective. Disrupts your economic flow. The biggest economic disruption we had in the United States was the Civil War in, you know, in the, you know, 1861 to 1865, right? After that, everything kind of, there's a stable foundation for U.S. economic development to happen. In Latin America, you're starting to develop something, and then it's a military dictatorship, so the economic model changes, right? Years later, it's switching back. So that instability never allowed Latin America to have that benefit that the U.S. of having that stable, you know, foundation for which to build in your economy and the systems, the, you know, the industrial system, so that to proceed. Out of that instability is where you have folks saying, you know what, I don't want to stay here. I'm going to go someplace where it's stable, which was the United States, right? And I think that also hurts Latin America because it prevents it from having, because they had just as many resources as the United States, and they had those populations, but they weren't able to adequately develop the processes and you know, distribution channels that would have allowed them to really surpass. I mean, Argentina in, you know, the beginning of the 1900s had actually a higher GDP than the United States, right? It was a strong farming and agricultural producer. But as the United States then went into its industrial revolution, Argentina wasn't able to keep up, right? Colombia is another place. Mexico are examples of this. And so I think that adds to the conversation about, you know, why folks wanted to come to the United States, right? And when they were here, where they saw this real opportunity to expand their livelihood, whether it be through entrepreneurship or whether it be through just having a stable life. You don't have to go worry about a military dictatorship in about 10 years. You know, when you get back, the United States seemed like a better place to stay.
Hmm. Yeah, man. So, you know, kind of moving forward to like, we talked about a little bit about the present, of, what's going on economically and stuff. I mean, let's talk about the future, right? What is one, either migration, right? I mean, is growing. I don't know if you have any opinions on migration and border control. Maybe just before we deep dive into future,
Yeah.
let's talk about migration and people coming here and how things are today. The population, is it growing? Just kind of talk about migration itself and sort
Yeah.
of the state of that, coming here, staying here, being, having a passport or having a license. What's happening now? What's your opinion on all the craziness that we see with migration?
Yeah, I think it's very short-sighted. And in
Hmm.
being short-sighted, we're not going to allow for this longer growth, healthy growth trend for our country. And I say that wholeheartedly, because whether it be, so you've heard of the DACA Kids, right? The Deferred Action for Children,
Yeah.
who basically, were brought here to the United States. Imagine being 2 years old, your parents come here, they come here undocumented, and you grew up here, and people underestimate the value of how good they have it in the United States, because you were just born here, right? We
Yeah.
were just born here, and out of that benefit, we're American citizens, right? But like, let's just take Texas and Mexico. If you happen to be born within miles apart, if you had been born 10 miles up the river, you'd be an American citizen. 10 miles down the river, you're a Mexican.
Yeah. There's a fake line that changes your entire life.
Exactly. Yeah.
10 miles
And
away.
well said. Well said. And I think that, because to become a citizen, you have to study, its history. You have to take a test. I mean, we never had to take a test as U.S. citizens to prove our citizenship, right? And I also think there's an unhealthy sense of xenophobia that permeates societies. Society, whenever there's something new. I mean, we're seeing migration from Southeast Asia, we're seeing migration from Africa, from the Middle East, as well as Central America in modern day times. This is disrupting, what quote unquote, you see what the American population has traditionally been, right? This Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right?
Yeah.
Now clashing with, whether it be different religions, different cultural norms. And so I remember asking Secretary Vilsack, he was the Secretary of Agriculture, I worked for him. And he gave me such a great answer. He said, there was a time when in Iowa, he was also the former governor of Iowa, when the migrants came in, they would be adopted by a community, right? So there was like a church that kind of received them. The community helped with their acclimation into their new society, right? Helping them kind of learn the norms of, how we do things here, helping them with the language and everything. I think that now, and that's kind of ebbed away. Right now, when people come to the country, they're sponsored by a company, right? And so the company provides them with kind of sense of, yep, this person's going to be able to work here and they'll have, the economic resources to contribute. He said that, the danger in that is when, you see somebody else coming in because they got a job and you yourself, an American citizen, are struggling, you're saying, man, that job could have been mine. And that company gave it to that other person and is supporting them, but they're not supporting me. So you get a sense of disenfranchisement, right? And now there's this sense like, man, get out of here. That should have been my job. And so that resentment can be deep rooted and can be easily, multiplied. And they don't have the immigrants who come here. They now don't have that cultural kind of backing of the community.
Right.
Migration period, and so that creates problems. I've always thought that the best way to kind of integrate societies is to have them work together. When my parents immigrated here, we had a lot of great friends in Boston because my father was a mechanic. And, my father worked with, all white dudes, right? And they were so welcoming. We would go to, they'd invite us over for barbecues during the summer at their house, and we'd invite them over to, our cultural celebrations. And it allowed for this exchange. And in the end, we don't have to like each other, but I think that we have to recognize our fundamental right to be able to coexist. And that's being taken away. I think that's, but here's the other thing though, Walter, is that I think this wave right now of Latin American expansion going on. So for example, the population, the US Latino population is about a little under 60 million, if it hasn't crossed that number yet. And that's about 18.5% of the US population. And it's expanding at a 2% rate per year, right? So Latinos are definitely growing in sense of population. And, if they haven't already, I believe they will be the biggest ethnic minority in the United States. They'll have surpassed African Americans, right? But the cultural contributions go way back. Early rock and roll, if you look at early rock and roll, it had a lot of influences by either Latino artists or Latino Hispanic cultural musical traditions, right? And how that affected. And you look at even now, you look at, how music and popular culture, arte agave, right? Which is wonderful that you're doing. You're weaving in these other cultural aspects into this larger tapestry. Look at the winners of the best Academy Award films the last couple of years have been Mexican directors, the way they tell stories. So I think that the relationship, the cultural relationship with the US and Latin America is actually a rich one. We appreciate each other's cultures, right? I just don't know where that invisible line is that you talked about, where all of a sudden, no, it's not all right to do this. Don't speak Spanish here, or don't play your music too loud. It's on both sides, man. I've seen, unfortunately, Latino, we carry with us this really ugly part of our culture, which is a very racist culture, a very, you might have heard the term machista, right? Which talks about male-dominated culture. The women shouldn't go to school. The women stay home, and that in Latin America is evolving too. Or against the LGBT community, right? And so there's these ugly parts of both our cultures, prevalent there, which are also playing into this integration, right? Because not only is the U.S. culture changing, but Latin American culture is changing, and that's all changing together at the same time. Again, going back to the melting pot, the temperature gets a little bit too high and it starts to boil over into tensions. But despite that, I think that it's important to keep in mind that the Latino population is also economically growing, right? So gross domestic product, right, is about 2.3 trillion last time I saw it, which is a 2017 figure, right? And it's accounting for 82% of the labor force growth in the United States between 2010 and 2017. And if Latinos in the United States were to kind of be clumped together and put as categorized as a country, we would be the 8th largest in the world, right?
Do they like to be categorized together, or do they like to have their own separate?
Here's the thing, right? Think about it. Think of, somebody from Texas and California. I always love this because they're like, Texas is better, California is the best, or Florida, right? So take that, superimpose that healthy kind of conflict between states, and now superimpose that into 26 countries, right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
Cubans, and Mexicans are vastly different in the way they approach things.
100%. Yep.
Their cultural traditions, right? So I don't think, we don't like all to be clumped together. I think we have a common thread that's makes with its language and traditions and probably religion that binds us all together. But I think in earlier generations, there's also a lot of differences, whether it be the cuisine out of Mexico versus the cuisine out of Colombia, right? Or whether it be Brazilian, which is, a whole different genre there because of their language, their rich history. And so, no, we don't like to be clumped together, but we love to be around each other.
Yeah.
Folks in the United States, Midwesterners versus the Northeasterners, right?
It's a great point what you said with Texas and California, because if you ask, somebody, they're like, "Oh, you from Texas?" They're like, "No, I'm from California." And the same thing with a Texas person, like, "No, I'm from Texas." But if they go to another country, they're like, "No, I'm from the United States." You know what I mean? So like, it's kind of the same thing. I never really like thought about it like that, but it's like all the states in America, in the United States, think they're the best and the greatest, got the best food. No, New York has the best pizza. No, Chicago has the best pizza. But if they leave there and they're like, no, we're United States. Like they don't say, maybe New Yorkers say they're from New York because they like to brag. But I love that analogy of the Texas and the California, and how they're separate but under kind of one sort of thing. And that's a good binding. It's a commonality that a trait that they can have and put together. But to your point, you're saying it's the eighth largest in the world, 2.3 trillion. It's good to be in numbers. It's good to be kind of there. You have a voice. I mean, I guess the more the Latin community gets together, the bigger voice they're going to have for any sort of change, if they want. I mean, right? I mean, it's good. It's good to have the numbers.
And you're beginning to see also that kind of that political maturization going on. So like the Puerto Ricans were really, they to me, they've always matured in kind of like the late 60s and 70s, and how they have a presence in New York politics, right? The Cubans immigrating in the 1960s to Florida, by the 80s, they have a strong contribution in Florida politics, right? Marco Rubio, right? Their senator, right, of Cuban American descent, or Mexican, right? Antonio Villaraigosa was the mayor of LA, which is the second largest city in the United States, from his Mexican heritage, right? How it's playing out in Texas, right? The Castro brothers out of San Antonio, Joaquin and Castro. And so I think that, different pockets of Latino culture are beginning to, go through their political maturization. And then that's ultimately adding to a larger political evolution in the United States. And that's important because, to me, I've always seen there's two distinct I don't want to say classes, but groups of Latino cultures. There's kind of the first generation, right? Those are the parents that came here and spoke no English, and through their hard work, and ingenuity, were able to create a life, right? And that first generation who now has, like myself, the benefits of going to school and contributing and coming to this part of this larger culture. And I think that generation of Latinos is a really important one to watch, right? Because some of them can be bilingual, and that's great. Some of them aren't bilingual. Some of them are also, belong here, right? I talked about the DACA kids, right? Some of them, like myself, luckily that haven't been born here, I have, all of the full rights that the United States affords its citizens. But somebody who grew up here from the age of 1, just happened to come here undocumented, now doesn't have those rights, right? So there's that kind of difference going on. I'll sum it all up by saying this. Going back to history, I remember way back in history learning about the differences between the way Alexander the Great saw empire making, and the way the Romans saw empire making. And empire making is probably the wrong term, so I'm just going to call it cultural integration. It's a much better way. Aristotle, who I believe it was Aristotle who taught Alexander the Great of Macedonia, taught him something important. As Alexander built the largest empire of his time in the world, when he would go into a new territory, one of the things he began doing was, to some extent, he honored the local customs. They just had to see the Macedonians or the Greeks as kind of, now the authority in that local land. But he also began intermarrying locals with some of the members of his army, right? And the thinking behind this was that the kids of those marriages would grow up, in this accepting kind of Greek as local as their local customs, and so they would never rebel, because when they would rebel, they would be rebelling against their parents, right? Like I can't hate Greeks, my father, right? And so he really interweaved and connected cultures to create a new one, right? Kind of like the pedagogy example, right? He brought them together, and so it was a much more tight-knit community or new group that he created, where Romans went in, Romans plundered, pillaged, and raped, right? And they would rape the women. And so the children grown out of those rapes would grow to hate their fathers, the Romans. The fathers were never there, right? And they had plundered and pillaged rather than create something new, they took away. And so this later leads to the downfall of Rome, right? Because you have generations that have grown up hating Romans. And so I take this as a cautionary tale here in the United States, because if we don't figure out a way to embrace each other, we're going to, successive generations might grow up hating each other, right? And that's a danger for the disintegration of our country, which I deeply love. And I believe it's, we're a work in progress, man. I mean, look at, and to bring it to, what's going on now, look at the Constitution which is kind of the standard, right, of how to form a government across the world now. The U.S. Constitution, one African-American was 3/5 of a white person. Women didn't have the right to vote. These things eventually were fixed by successive generations, right? The Civil Rights Movement, the 14th Amendment, the women's suffrage, people who didn't own land couldn't vote at the time too, right? So that talked about economic equality, right? So I think there's been successive generations of American generations that have stepped up and made this country better. And if we don't keep that perspective of who are, new Americans, add to this, tapestry of making America better and evolving it, and there's a danger there, because we could fall the weight of the Romans, where now you hate the culture that you're part of, right? And that's, to me, that's very dangerous. So I think, again, what you do is great, because you're helping to kind of integrate, you're helping us to learn better. And ultimately, we both here learned of so many different ways in which our cultures intersect and are so much similar. It's just that we're looking at it from different perspectives.
Yeah. And, that kind of leads me into, you mentioned like kind of like cultural identification. I've asked this question kind of on the podcast and in general in the past, because, when I was doing Arte Agave, we had Latino culture, right? With the O on the end. And a friend, it was a couple of years ago, and a friend of mine was like, hey, you might want to drop the O. And they sent me an article, and I was like, that makes sense. And then they were like, we should add an X. And that's when I started getting really confused. I was like, why would I add an X? So a question that, and I don't mean this to be a controversial thing, but I've been sort of just asking everybody, because someone like myself that's sort of in between says, okay, no O, no A, but put an X. And then some people are doing that. And then I see a lot of people in the Latin community that are like, why are we changing? Like, they're like, I understand dropping the O, but why are we adding this X? Why are you changing my language? And some people are like, well, it's the language of our oppressors, so I know this is a real kind of difficult conversation for some people, but I'm always trying to just understand, as somebody that's plainly not from the Latin culture, am I adding an X? Am I dropping the O? Why or why not? Should I not be trying to learn Spanish? I'm trying to navigate. I always try to get someone's opinion. I know you're very educated, and you and I have a great rapport. So I'm always just trying to see everyone's kind of perspective on the language and why it's changing a little bit. And, obviously, racial and gender biases. So I know people, it always come from a good place, but I kind of want to see your perspective on it.
Yeah, and great question, because it took me some time to kind of grapple with it, understand it, and it talks to after a certain age, we just don't want to change, right? It's human nature, right? I'm set in my ways, leave me alone. So
I'm good.
like
I did my time. I'm good.
yeah, but it goes back to this business notion that if you don't evolve, you die, right? And I think that that's applicable for oneself as well. Is that we have to keep up. My fountain of youth. I always say this when I speak to large groups is education and the ability to learn, because it refreshes me, my mind, and my perspective, and I feel young again. So that's how I've been able to find, and so that forces me to keep on learning. So when this whole Latinx thing came out, I'm like, yeah, like you, I was like, what is that? What's going on there? And I mean, it's so in Spanish language, right? Everything is masculine and feminine, right?
Yeah.
So it would be a Latino and a woman would be a Latina, right? But the general capture of the Latino culture, which used to be Hispanic at one point, right? That's a whole other conversation later. But you're now perpetuating this whole machista ideology, right? You're not recognizing the women, right? So for a while there was Latino/A, Latino, Latina, right? So and then the newer generations just said, no, throw that away, put in X, because not only are there Latinos, Latinas, but there's everything in between: gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual. Yep. And so X was a better way to capitalize. And I think, just kind of throwing it out, putting an X in there. But I know within the Latino culture, right? Like even me, I still say Latino. They're like, no, that's grammatically incorrect. What are you doing there? No, right. I don't want to change it. Latino can be, can encapsulate the Latina. So it's this debate going on, but essentially, and I mean, this just happened in the last couple of years. So some folks have adopted Latino X. It makes sense. It also talks about the new generation, which captures all of this. Some folks are more traditionalist, saying, no, this doesn't make sense. It's the danger where, just if we just get too caught up in that, it can just lead to divisions, right? So in the end,
right.
My approach has been like, what would you like to be called? Because in the end, just sure. Like it all comes back to the same thing, that we're this one culture that is really multifaceted and is always evolving. Because believe it or not, I think that if not the first, I'll have to check this stat, but the second largest Spanish speaking country in the world is the United States. Right?
That would make
think
sense.
About that. Yeah, think about that for a second, and how, that affects things. So there's
that's huge. That's a huge number. If that's correct, that's a huge number.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the first of I want to say it's probably the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. But I get it, right? I mean, there are, again, with that example, there are folks, traditional Americans, who only see America should be a certain way. And if that doesn't evolve, whatever doesn't bend breaks. And so I think that we need to, as we move forward, learn to, figure out how to appreciate each other. And, there are certain boundaries, like it's like, great, I'm gonna, go back to kind of my core group, and I can stay in my core group, but never allowing yourself to shut off from everything else. When you do that, you're denying yourself a great opportunity to grow, evolve, and learn on new cultures. And that's for both cultures. I say this to Latino cultures all the time too, where they're like, oh, we shouldn't learn English. Why? Like, I know that in pockets of Miami, when I was doing campaigns, people be like, why are you speaking to me in English? This is Miami. I'm like, why don't you learn English? This is the we need to, if we want folks to, appreciate us, we have to appreciate them. So it's a two-way street. And there's nothing that says we can't be bilingual.
Yeah.
We can learn. You look at Europe. Europe is, minimal bilingual, if not many languages, and benefit does that provide us with? So let's keep an open mind and, move forward. Because if we do it right, the United States still has its better days ahead.
Yeah. So,
We don't
so
want to.
man, one, thanks for your time here. You know, we're doing this on a Sunday, so I don't want to keep you too long, man.
No, no
You
worries.
know, what's next, man? How are we looking with the Latin community, the next generation? You know, there's a lot of, you know, woke, Me Too, social justice warriors out there. You know, are we going to get through it? You know, one of my takes on social media is, you know, it gets everything out in the open. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
everyone just,
yeah.
you know, obviously everyone just spewing whatever. You know, so what do we look like in the future, man? What are the future generations? You know, they're going to get through this? Are we all going to be getting along later on down the road?
You know, I think so. There's this paradigm called the villain victim paradigm, and that I've learned a lot from. I learned this. I was in Israel for a leadership program, and I learned it from them. And it basically talks about how both Israelis and Palestinians see themselves as victims, right? One because they were persecuted and they're constantly being attacked, and the other one because their land was taken away and they're constantly being oppressed, right? So they're both victims, and yet they always see the other side as villains, right? You're coming in here and you're taking my land, and you have this oppressive regime, and you're expanding your territory, and the other one saying all you do is bomb us, and you're constantly threatening our existence, right? So you're the villain.
Yep.
This paradigm makes any dialogue forward effective because you're never going to trust the person on the other side, and that's why you always need a third party mediator. Right? And to me, I learned that because I think that can happen in any culture, and I think subconsciously it happens, right? So if we don't watch out for that, it's dangerous because you'll never move past that. And, any other group will be a villain and you'll be the victim, when in reality, we're both.
Right.
And so I always talk about, think about generations of children now where we are comfortable with diversity, right? Where a generation before us, schools were segregated. So,
Yeah.
Being able to coexist, wasn't cool. You stay on your side, I stay on my side. And I think that if we don't begin to break down these constructs, because all they are is mental human constructs, right? There's no, clear law that, well, there have been laws that, push this forward, but, no natural law that can divide this. I think that as we move forward, it's important for us to instill in future generations the ability to have dialogue, because somehow, some way, in this political environment, we've lost the ability to learn from each other and listen. I don't need to convince you all. I don't think you need to convince me, but it's great when we can just listen to each other and be like, I didn't know this. This makes sense to me, and vice versa. I think the need for dialogue is important. And the need to, realize that we can all coexist is strong. We need to respect each other's spaces and norms. And, not again, I don't have to assimilate everything into you. I can retain some of mine and I can share some of mine, nor do you have to assimilate. And helping generations not to carry those outdated modes of thinking that are limiting is going to be important, because with those Palestinian and Israeli example, one of the things the speaker I learned from said, all we can do as generation is hold the line and make sure things don't devolve. He goes, it's that next generation, those kids now who have learned to kind of coexist and live together, who will have a new way of thinking and will be able to take the peace process to a new stage. Unfortunately, we're stuck in this old system that we can't outthink our way out of, and so all we have to do is hold the line. And so, man, if our generation can, hold the line and let these next generations, figure out a way to do that, that'll be great. And it's been done in the United States before. We talked about, the abolishment of slavery, the Civil Rights Act, or the, women's suffrage movement, right? It was successive generations that fixed the problem. So that's how I think we'll get along, man. I like to not only look as the glass half full, but there's some water there that I can drink. So with that being said, I'm getting thirsty.
Dude, that's beautiful, man. Like that's awesome. You have some really good analogies. And that's the point. And you're right. We're older, so we're like, we're good. This is how it's been done, and we should be doing it this way. And we shouldn't just knock out other people's thoughts. I like to hold the line and wait for the next generation to kind of move forward. So cool, man. Listen, dude, thanks for your time here today, man. I really appreciate your insight, and I kind of got my history lesson for the day. Like I said, I think this is awesome. I think more people should just have conversations. I think seeing people just arguing on social media, and it's like I see arguments and I'm looking at it, I'm like, you're both right. Like, you're both right, but you're just arguing, and you're in the same group, like you're just arguing X's and O's or apples and oranges and stuff like that. So, man, so I applaud you for, you being the history teacher that you are, the knowledge that you have, and, being someone that just has conversations. I think we need more of this today more than ever about, different perspectives. And, sometimes people just like to talk and they're not listening. So thanks for sharing your thoughts and sharing all this insight with our listeners, man. I appreciate you.
Oh, no, thank you, man. And again, I applaud what you're doing, because you're providing this important platform for dialogue to take place, us to learn from each other, and us to grow from each other, man. So big fan. I wish you all the best, and, love to be back anytime you want me to, man. This is a lot of fun. So
thanks, man. Well, hopefully we'll get Arte Agave into DC in September.
Yes,
that's what I'm trying to do, man. So I'm on like this wait, it's early June right now. So I'm on this just sort of waiting thing. And I'm talking to one of the venues in DC. So I think the goal right now is bring Arte Agave, to DC in September. And then New York, we might do it in October. So, cool. let's get the group back, Pro Hispanica, Maria, the boys, and let's celebrate a little bit.
Absolutely, we need it. Great.
Well, cool, dude. Listen, man, thank you so much for this, and I appreciate you. Everybody listening, we'll talk to you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, man.